that satisfaction equals sort of conforming to the GHP. We understand why conforming to the moral law is important, and it's important because it is governed by the standard, right? As we said, the standard of morality. The standard is going to govern action. Action that conforms is moral. Action that does not conform is immoral. So that satisfaction has a lot to do with an understanding of how the agent changes or modifies his or her life to conform with the GHP. And the two elements that he discusses, the first one is tranquility. Tranquility is the first one. He says that tranquility allows one with little pleasure to obtain satisfaction. What does that mean? It allows one who has very, very little pleasure, low levels of pleasure, to attain satisfaction. Why would this be the case? You can imagine if you had a very tranquil, almost Zen state, that it would take very, very little pleasure, outside pleasure, in order for you to arrive at happiness, right? The tranquil person doesn't require a lot of pleasure, right? So that the tranquil person, tranquility does not require increased levels of pleasure. So the tranquil person does not require increased levels of pleasure to arrive or attain, to arrive at happiness. When I have tranquility, I don't need a lot of pleasure in order to become happy, right? The tranquil person, and it depends on how tranquil you get. He addresses this later. The tranquil person is sort of in a contemplative, meditative state, not necessarily literally. In everything that they do, in all actions throughout life, is sort of reserved. And only a little bit of pleasure is required in order to make that person happy because of this underlying tranquility, right? This element of satisfaction, right? So that it's balanced by this sense of tranquility. And I don't think it's off to say that this is an attempt at recognizing this balance between polemics, right? Good, evil, tranquility, and on the other hand, excitement. So we have tranquility on the one hand, but on the other hand we have excitement, right? You can be too tranquil. You can be so tranquil that you now have this sort of removed stance, right? You have a stoic almost conception of morality, which is not what John Stuart Mill is referencing, though he does speak quite a bit and at length about stoicism, right? He's not saying that you should be stoic in that self, that pleasure then becomes something that's bad, right? It's not the claim. That would be counter to utilitarianism to say that pleasure is bad. We do require pleasure, and it shouldn't be that we live a life which shuns pleasure and that we're so tranquil that we don't need pleasure, because that's not utilitarianism. What he's saying is that tranquility will allow us to require far less levels of pleasure to arrive at happiness. The counterexample to that, not really counterexample, but the other extreme, the other side of that argument is one of excitement. Hey Charlene, how's it going? I know. Let's see. Sure. You want me to meet you in the office? Okay. Yeah, I do. Okay. Okay, so 2 o'clock. All right, sounds good. Bye. Okay. Where are we? Excitement. So, with respect to excitement, you have to recognize that it's important to have excitement, right? Excitement, the desire for pleasure is important, right? I'm maximizing pleasure. There really isn't anything bad in seeking out entertainment, right? You can go to the movies, you can go out to eat, you can have sex, you can play with your kids, you can throw a ball. All of these things, they're very exciting activities. They increase pleasure, but too much excitement can lead to considerable pain. right? If all that I do, if my life is entirely consumed with maximizing pleasure, with living this exciting life, I have problems, right? What ends up happening is that I have an inability to regulate this desire. So unlike tranquility, excitement does require increased levels of pleasure to arrive, at happiness. So you can see that they're different. Tranquility, I don't need a lot of pleasure to be happy, so I can attain happiness. And with excitement, it does require a lot higher levels of pleasure in order to arrive at happiness, right? So there's a distinction between the two. So let's just, for the sake of argument, John Stuart Mill doesn't put this in quantified terms, but just for a good visual so you have an understanding of what this means, imagine that we have a scale from 1 to 100, right? 1 being as miserable as you could possibly ever be, 0, no excitement at all. Actually, goes from 0 to 100. 0 to 100. 0 being an inability to attain pleasure at all, right, in any sense. 100 being the most pleasurable state possible. And what we're trying to do, so this is a measure of pleasure. This is pleasure. And what we have to recognize is at what point, sort of like a threshold, do I arrive at tranquility? Well, the tranquil person might be able to arrive at happiness at, let's say, 30, right? So that the tranquil person, and this is just for example, right? This is just so that you understand the idea. It's not necessarily, he does not at all in any sense represent it in quantified terms, but it's a good visual, right? So tranquility, I'm able to arrive at happiness at this number, right? So now I'm happy. The person who is more governed by excitement has a greater difficulty to arrive at happiness. It takes more pleasure for me to get the same level of happiness, right? So for the excited person, it might take as much as like 85 to arrive at the same sense of happiness. And that's what he's saying, right? It becomes a balance. Tranquility and excitement become almost like a yin and a yang in this conception, in this understanding of happiness, right? In the GHP. The tranquil person requires less pleasure in order to arrive at happiness than the excited person who requires more pleasure to arrive at happiness. But the both are recognizing that an individual person isn't completely one or the other, that the individual person has tranquil aspects to his or her personality and excited aspects to his or her personality. And what it is at all times is a balance. It's a balance between, right? It's a balance between too much excitement will lead to pain, too much tranquility will lead to a total loss of pleasure, which is also, the lack of pleasure is pain. So they're the same, right? So it's important to understand this balance. Okay. All right, so the next section that Mill talks about